Thank you for joining Darien Library this Monday afternoon for Trial of the Century, Nuremberg. Now, this is part one of a four-part series, so I hope that you signed up for all four. If not, please contact me and I'll help you do that. We're joined today by Mark Albertson, who is the historical research editor at Army Aviation Magazine and is a longtime member of the United States Naval Institute. In addition, Mark teaches history at Norwell Community College, and we're lucky to share the next hour with him. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. And I'm going to pass the mic over to Mark.
This is this November 20th, by the way, November 20th of 2020 marked the 75th anniversary of the convening of the Nuremberg Trials. And the Nuremberg Trials, as I mentioned, convened November 20, 1945, will continue on to April 1949. And there are many trials that will take place. Of course, the Nazi bigwigs were tried first from November 1945 to September 1946. But there are a variety of other trials. And the major criminals, and I'll get into this as we go along, the major criminals will be tried at Nuremberg, but those considered lesser criminals, some of these will be tried in the areas that they perpetrated their crimes. And just as a point of reference, I mean, you couldn't really get all these criminals tried at Nuremberg. You just didn't have the facilities, so they dispersed the trials. In the British zone alone, recall Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation, unlike in 1918-19. The Soviet zone, the American zone, the French zone, the British zone. In the British zone alone, they had over 356 trials, and they prosecuted some. They brought to trial some 1,000 defendants. That's just in the British zone alone. So it gives you an idea the scope of this event in international jurisprudence. And I just want to give you a cause. In fact, I did send, by the way, a handout for this talk to the library. However, if any of you know my email, the library is free to give away my email address. If you're going to email me, just note the Darien Library. I will gladly send it to you, the handout, myself. It's called Trial of the Century, Nuremberg. And I have a quote here, and the first one obviously is going to be Adolf Hitler. State boundaries are made by man and changed by man. We National Socialists must hold unflinchingly to our aim in foreign policy, namely to secure for the German people the land and soil to which they are entitled upon this earth. Now that comes out of Mein Kampf. And then I have one here too, interesting too, by Erwin Bauer. And this is going to get us to session 3 here, the killers in the white coats, about the Nazi program of organized medical killing. No one approves of the new sterilization laws more than I do, but I must repeat over and over again that they only constitute a beginning. Edwin Bauer, director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Biology. And so how do we get to this? How do we actually have to, why do we have to have trials? When you go back to the 19th century, and those of you who have taken my courses at Norwell Community College, those of you who have been to many of my talks, know I am not a fan of World War I and World War II. There's only one war, the Great War, 1941, 1914, 1922, 1931, 1945. But there's a backdrop to this. And when you go back to the 19th century, following the American and French revolutions, part of what you're seeing here is, the ideas coming out of the Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment, the ideas of liberalism, democracy, republicanism, secularism, socialism, nationalism, parliamentarianism. And also this is occurring in an era of the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, technology, the globe, the world is changing, especially in the West. And however, there are certain philosophers coming out of this. One of them is Georg Hegel. And you are seeing with Hegel, who, you know, and I have his writings, they're fascinating to read. They truly are. That the ultimate endeavor of a people is the state. People are second to the state. War is actually the greatest locomotive of change. Peace can be stagnation. Now, this is going to influence people later on, like Karl Marx. You know, this idea of the idea of material dialectical materialism. He was more of a scientific socialist, where you know, these utopian socialists like Saint Simon, Robert Owen, Louis Blanc, who are saying that, well, if the worker and the employer, or the bourgeoisie, factory owner, whatever you want to call them, come together to can stabilize society and the economy. Marx comes along and says, are you kidding? The only way the worker is going to get what he wants is the violent overthrow of the established order to create this classless society based on the dictatorship of the proletariat. However, Benito Mussolini is convinced that the age of reason, age of enlightenment, these are reasons why you're going to have 1914, because people are not equipped to run a country. Sounds a little like Alexander Hamilton here, folks. And so he creates what's known as the corporate fascist state, where large corporations and large financial institutions run the economy, beneath, of course, the fascist overseers. The worker, well, the only liberty that exists is the liberty of the state. The liberty of the individual or the worker exists for the state. The state holds primacy. Here we go with Hegel. But you also have other philosophers. We're not only seeing this idea of the state holding primacy over the individual with some of these philosophers, but take people like, and it's interesting what you find here. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, in his addresses to the German nation, get a load of this. The Latin races and Jews are decadent and a source of human misery. Fichte assured the Germans that they were in fact the master race. The German language was the purest, German mythology the noblest, German character the strongest in the world. One day Fichte preached, Germans will find their true place in the sun. World dominators led by a small elite group of men who have no need for common human moral restraints. That is absolutely fascinating. That's Fichte. Then you have people like Heinrich von Treitschke. Heinrich von Treitschke is interesting, argued along similar lines here. Peace is a state of sloth, leaving the individual preoccupied with selfish concerns. Whereas the grandeur of war, get this, the grandeur of war consists in utter annihilation of puny man and the great conception of the state. Treitschke's state worship was an application to secular ends of the Christian dictum, thy service is perfect freedom. This concept linked up with Hegel's hypothesis that history had followed a predetermined forward path to reach the culmination of the Prussian state. So you are seeing in the 19th century, this, you know, keep in mind the German states, organizing the German states, this was new. You know, the Holy Roman Empire had been around since the 9th century. Napoleon will do away with it in December of 1805. And following the Treaty of Pressburg, he will organize the Confederation of the Rhine, 16 German city-states put together as a buffer to Tsarist Russia, which, if you understand too, in 1919 at Versailles, when they tore apart the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they put together such states as Poland, Austria-Hungary, Yugoslavia, countries like this, to keep Bolshevik Russia out. So you haven't had much of a change in this mindset. But during the 19th century too, some of the Austrians are preaching here, beware the pan-Slav flood. We're talking virulent nationalism here. And it's infecting many people. Virulent nationalism. Well, as royalty loses sway here, keep in mind you've been in this for a century and a half, where royalty is losing its grip. People are moving off the land to the cities. This is urbanization. As the Industrial Revolution takes off, people are moving to the cities to work in the factories. You're also creating a new class called the middle class, bourgeoisie, whatever you want to call it. People that are going to have a few dollars in their pocket who are able to be mobile. How is royalty supposed to exist when for centuries they existed by keeping the mass of the people on the land and impoverished? That's changing. And they're gonna go the way of the dodo by 1919. It's changing your economy, it's changing your politics, it's changing society, it's changing culture. And so part of this change comes with people who will take advantage of this. And even here in the United States, going back again to the Industrial Revolution, you had two schools of thought in this country, which guided the United States. The Jeffersonian notion of the agrarian as the salt of the earth, and which the Southern aristocracy, the plantation owner, or the gulag owners are going to gravitate towards, which is based on slavery. And then up north, the idea of industrialization, finance. Well, guess who's going to win that, what you call the Civil War? I call it the revolt of the planters, because that's exactly what it was. That was a revolution from the right, but it's defeated, and the Southern aristocracy is really based on white supremacy. It's also a window into what's going to happen to the monarchs in Europe by 1919. You can't have a country of farmers going to a conventional war, total war, with a nation of wrench turners. It's not going to work. But since we are now an industrialized state, it's interesting, an industrialized state, we now take off as that industrialized state, and by the middle of the night, by the 1900s, half the American public is off the land. But you see, as we get to the end of the century, America in a wholesale change, the War of 1898. And I have a book here written by a man, but this is before 1898. I have a book here written by a man by the name of Josiah Strong. The book is called Our Country. And fortunately for me, I have a first edition of this book. Now, listen to this. You would think maybe you're in Germany, but you're not. During the last 4 years, this goes back, this is 1880. During the last 4 years, we have suffered a peaceful invasion by an army more than twice as vast as the estimated number of Goths and Vandals that have swept over Southern Europe and overwhelmed Rome. During the 90 years preceding 1880, 20 million foreigners made their homes in the United States, and 3/4 of them came during that last period. Not only are they coming in great numbers, but numbers rapidly increasing. Now, it's interesting too what he says here. Moreover, immigration not only furnishes the greater portion of our criminal. This guy's a cleric. Moreover, immigration not only furnishes the greater portion of our criminals, it is also seriously affecting the morals of the native population. We can not only glance at the political aspects of immigration, as we already have seen, and it is immigration which has fed fat, the liquor power, and there is also the liquor vote. Immigration furnishes most of the victims of Mormonism, and there is a Mormon vote. Interesting here what he is saying. Now, he's not a fan of those people coming here from Southern Europe. And again here, he says about the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon. This is absolutely fascinating. The world will enter upon a new stage of its history. The final competition of races for which the Anglo-Saxon is being schooled, and he writes this in italics. Long before thousands of millions are here, the mighty centrifugal tendency inherent in the stock, again, the Anglo-Saxon, in this stock, with strength in the United States and will assert itself. Then this race of unequal energy, with all the majesty of numbers and the might of wealth behind it, the representative, let us hope, the largest liberty, the purest Christianity, the highest civilization, having developed peculiarly aggressive traits calculated to impress its institutions upon mankind, will spread over the earth. Now, interesting, if I read this not amiss, this powerful race, get this, will move down upon Mexico, down upon Central and South America, out upon the islands of the sea, over upon Africa and beyond. Nothing can save the inferior race but a ready, pliant assimilation to the Anglo-Saxon. Whether the feebler and more abject races are going to be regenerated and raised up is already very much a question. What if it should be God's plan to people the world with better and finer material? That's the United States. He wrote this book in 1884, and he is a cleric. And so you see, not just in Europe, but also here, this growth in this exclusivity that sees shutting out those considered not worthy. And of course, you know, as you have your problems today in this country, especially with Blacks and Latinos, you know, you go back to 1919 when the first 20 Blacks were brought here. White supremacy, racism has been endemic in the fabric of this nation. And there's no detergent of liberty that seems to be able to wash it out of that American shirt. So this idea of exclusivity is not just a German factor, it is also here in the United States. And again, you see people like Friedrich Nietzsche professing in Germany in the 19th century, in the German states, in Germany, this idea of the German as the Superman. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Englishman, who, by the way, will marry the daughter of Richard Wagner, the well-known German composer, a composer who was the favorite of Adolf Hitler. And so you see him professing the nobility and the superiority of the German race. And by the way, he will go to Germany and get audience with the Kaiser, by the way. And he will be held, and Hitler will meet him before Houston Stewart Chamberlain dies. And so this notion of the superiority of the so-called Germanics didn't come up right away with the Nazis. This is something that was effervescing for years, even decades, and even a century, and just a little bit more. And so even here in the United States, you know, when you get to the United States, there's this notion of trying to control populations that are not really considered pollutants to the strain. And interesting here too, what Adolf Hitler is later going to say here. You know, Georg Hegel stated, and to go back to Hegel, that the ultimate endeavor is the state, that people need to preserve the state. People are second to the state. This is Adolf Hitler talking about the state, if you want to use that term. This, again, is in Mein Kampf. In general, it should not be forgotten that the highest aim of human existence is not the preservation of the state, let alone a government, but the preservation of the species. And if the species itself is in danger of being oppressed or utterly eliminated, the question of legality is reduced to a subordinate role. Then even if the methods of the ruling power are alleged to be legal 1,000 times over, nonetheless, the oppressed people's instinct for self-preservation remains the loftiest justification of their struggle with every weapon. Only through recognition of this principle have wars of liberation against internal and external enslavement of nations on this earth come down to us in such majestic historical examples. And here's what he says: human law cancels out state law. Well, you saw that emblematic here in Michigan last year and in Washington on the 6th. And if a people is defeated in its struggle for human rights, this merely means that it has been found too light in the scale of destiny for happiness of survival on this earth. For when our people is not willing or able to fight for existence, providence in its eternal justice has decreed that peoples end. The world is not for cowardly peoples. And when we get to week 3 here on the killers in the white coats, you're going to get this handout, the handout here. And so you see this notion here, and this is based off what? Well, it's based off in part Darwin. You know, the idea of selection. You know, the weak die, strong survive. And Ernst Haeckel, who was a German historian philosopher, preached this. He was a disciple of Darwin, and Hitler became a disciple in a way of Darwin. Now, again, you are seeing this notion of the weak die, strong survive. You are seeing that in the ruthless kingdom of the animal world, the weak die, strong survive, and even over centuries, over millions of years, you've seen strains come in, strains go out. They could not survive. They are applying this to government. They are applying this to organizing societies. They are applying this to military affairs. They are applying this to culture. This is where you're going to see people later on like Julius Streicher, that low-rent, belly-scraping, the degenerate, who's going to be the editor of Der Stürmer, which is that low-rent publication featuring Jewish people in the more gross and crass positions of pornography. I mean, this is where this government goes eventually. Nazi, and this was being published before the Nazis took control of Germany. Julius Streicher. And just as a side note here, Streicher is going to be tried at Nuremberg. And you want to know how bad he was? Not even his fellow Nazis wanted to commiserate with him. How bad is that? And so you begin to see here, or hopefully gain a better appreciation of why you're going to have these trials in the first place. I mean, where do nations come off? Like even here, the Anglo-Saxon is superior. So what are blacks? What are Latinos? What are different people here? They're chopped liver? That's where this gets out of control. And so even here in the United States, this notion, in fact, sterilization will be that start of trying to keep populations in line, unacceptable populations in line. And interesting here, because when the doctors are put on trial, we see here that what part of their defense is going to be, and there's going to be doctors' trials here. This is one of the many different trials you're going to see, the doctors' trials, the trials of the Einsatzgruppen. And I'm going to get into a couple of those here. The Einsatzgruppen were the murder squads on the Eastern Front, led by people such as Otto Ohlendorf. And I'll get to that later on. But with sterilization, you are even seeing here in the United States, sterilization in Germany was against the law. In the United States, it won't be. In fact, before 1910, states like Indiana, California, Illinois, Virginia, Connecticut will go with sterilization. And the idea here is to curb the reproduction of maybe the criminally insane, mental incompetence, maybe some people who are, by the way, physically handicapped, incurably physically handicapped. This is part of what's known as the eugenics movement, coming out of the 19th century through the 20th. Helen Keller was believed in eugenics. Margaret Sanger believed in eugenics. Interesting here, and by 1914, they tried passing it. There was an Ernst Ruden in Germany who tried having this passed, and it didn't fly. It was voted down. Here, no. And so interesting here, and I have this here to show you here. Within 20 years, within 20 years of having it passed in 1909, in 20 years, 28 states in the United States passed legislation in various guises for sterilization. And so by that time, by the late 20s, by 1930, 15,000 Americans had been sterilized. By 1939, some 30,000 had been sterilized, 12,941 of them in California. And so you see this idea of planning populations getting legs, and it's running. However, having said that, getting off that for a moment, but the Nuremberg trials are going to be the backdrop of the Nuremberg trials here are going to be not just the doctors' trials, of course, war crimes, crimes against humanity, killing prisoners of war, unlawful deportations, the destructions of society. This is where this is going to go. And of course, the argument against this will be, well, this really hadn't been done before. Well, they're going to start. And so when you take a look at this backdrop as to why you're going to have these trials, you go back to the 19th century. And again, it's not just Germany. You are seeing here, even during the First World War, and some people are shocked at this. In fact, in my archives of military aircraft, I have even pictures of German World War I fighter planes with swastikas on them already. The swastika is already becoming an emblem for those from the right, ardent nationalism. That's already becoming a fact of life here. It's an emblem of ardent nationalism. And of course, the Nazis are going to pick up on this. And so when you go back to that, and you understand too that, even people like Treitschke were insinuating, Heinrich Treitschke and Johann Gottlieb Fichte were prophesizing here that yes, the Germanic race will wage war against the decadent races, against the Latin races, against the Jews. But it doesn't work by 1918. And of course, though, interesting here too, the backdrop for this is that the German army will never admit they lost the war. They did. Keep in mind what you're seeing here. One of the reasons that the Weimar Republic is going to fail, by the way, is because the British and the French did not support it to the extent necessary to ensure the survival of representative government in Germany. Germany did not have that's another problem with Germany. It did not have a track record of representative government. When Bismarck put together the German state, it was a German corporate state. And so the Hohenzollern sit up here, the corporate clientele underneath them, running the German economy. Big corporations, financial institutions, and that's another thing with Bismarck. Financial institutions would not be an entity unto themselves like they are in this country. In other words, Mitt Romney wouldn't have survived in Bismarck's Germany. He would have had to go to work for a living. But at the same time, as he's creating this German corporate state, you have to give something to the people. It draws them in, makes them compliant, makes them complicit in this corporate state. How about health insurance? How about pensions? How about unemployment insurance? Where do you think the Roosevelt administration was getting some of their ideas from in the 1930s? From Bismarck's corporate state. Things like the Swope Plan, the National Recovery Act, later on down the road in the United States. However, this is, even though they had a Reichstag, people could elect representatives, it's not truly a functioning system of representative government, because the Kaiser holds the reins in the end anyway. But the fact of the matter is, too, that in August 29, 1916, the war's not going the way Germany wanted it, and it's known as the silent coup in Germany. And so the German general staff, that veritable institution in Germany, will take control of the German state. And the Kaiser, well, Willie, why don't you go back to the estate, saw the wood and tend the garden, and we'll take care of it from here. But they're still not going to win the war, but there's no track record here of representative government. And so when the British and the French, particularly the French in particular, are interested in reparations from Germany, and I'm not saying that Germans didn't deserve to pay reparations, they do. That's not the point. The point here is that if the British and the French had also paid attention to democratic precepts and offered to help Germany develop representative government, maybe you wouldn't have had a continuing chapter in the war, the next chapter of the war. But you are. But the point here is that when the army lost the war and refuses to acknowledge its responsibility, well, no, we didn't lose the war. The big lie. We were stabbed in the back by Democrats, socialists, communists, and the inveterate Jew. And interesting, some 100,000 Jewish German men served in the German army. And many of these men were more supporter of the Kaiser and the German state than they were Jewish. I'm fighting for my Kaiser and fatherland. What happens here? And so when you take a look at what happens through Germany in the 1920s, keep in mind, in this country, you have an elected government known as the Weimar Republic. That's fine. You can elect Democratic Socialists. You can elect Independent Socialists. You can elect the Catholic Center Party. You can elect the Democratic Party. Many of the government functionaries in this country had already been applied by the military dictatorship and the imperial government. They were to the right. And to give you a case in point, between 1918 and 1922, there were 376 political murders in Germany. 354 by the right, only 22 by the left. Of those 376 murders, 63 people will be prosecuted. 11 will be sentenced to death. All 11 were from the left, not the right. Note, too, that when Hitler fostered his ill-fated Munich putsch, which, by the way, he didn't want to do, he was more or less forced into it. You may not believe that, but his followers were looking to create that German state, and it was only going to be in Bavaria. But at the same time, he couldn't disavow his followers, so he engaged in this ill-fated putsch. But the fact of the matter is, he will be tried for this. Instead of being shot for treason, he's going to get 5 years, served 9 months. And this is where he writes his treatise, Mein Kampf. So it shows you where this country is going. And at the same time, the military, Hans von Seeckt, chairman of the German General Staff, is, no matter what government Germany has, the military is still going to remain as a state within the state. And it does. And Hitler will gravitate toward this. So you can see where this state is going. And so as you get into the Depression, and the Nazis were not doing well in the voting booth, they were the communists for that matter, but they will after October 1929, you are seeing a more draconian Germany emerge until finally January 30, 1933, when the businessmen, the bankers, and the military convinced President Paul von Hindenburg, who was General Paul von Hindenburg, and by the way, one of the two perpetrators of the military dictatorship, him and General Erich Ludendorff in 1916, sends for the man he didn't want to send for. But he's pushed into this. He's getting old and enfeebled at this point, feebled anyway at this point. That what he used to call sometimes that vulgar little corporal from Austria. That's another thing about Hitler. He was Austrian. He didn't become a German citizen until 1932. So he becomes chief of the German, he becomes chancellor of the government. Hindenburg is still the president, might have final say, but now the Nazis have that foot in the door, and they're going to take advantage of this and obviously take full power by 1934. And they implement their policies where the German race is considered the master race. Jewish people, gypsies, Slavs. Hitler once made a remark about the United States, and he said, interesting, I don't know how many of you have ever heard this, that a society that's half Judified and half Negrified will not survive. Now, I don't want to alarm you unduly, but can that remark be resurrected today? You know, some of our citizens are not all white folks. Some of them are Black. They're not all Christians. Some are Jewish. Some are Muslim. Some are Buddhist. You mean we can't make room for everybody here? What's up with that? You know, so go back to what Hitler once said. And so when you see how Hitler is going to rearm Germany, and you see in the writings, the Goebbels, his pronouncements against Jewish people, Goering was no saint here either. In fact, interesting when you take a look at what happened January 6th in this country, and I'm going to get into this with Goering. I'll get into this next time we meet. One of the crimes he will be tried and convicted on will be the overthrow of a representative form of government known as the Weimar Republic. Does that give you a notion as to what could be possible here to this plethora of merrymakers in Michigan and in Washington? Interesting, isn't it? And we helped push this at Nuremberg. What's happened? Interesting. You know, when you have a window into history such as this, fascinating. And so Hitler is going to rearm Germany. He's going to cater to the military. He needs their support. And big businessmen and the bankers. Do you honestly think they care? Many of them care about what's going to happen to the Jewish people, the Slavs, and the Gypsies? No. And keep in mind too, what's going to be deemed a criminal organization at Nuremberg, the SS, the Black Guard. Himmler gets to and this is fascinating. Himmler, in an effort to spread the risk here. Spread the risk. How about that? In an effort to spread the risk, is ready to expand the ranks of the SS by offering honorary or actual commissions of rank to certain members of German society. For instance, royalty, the holdovers here of these noble families. You will see a plethora of them get honorary rank of major, colonel, I mean even general in the SS. Doctors, and this is going to get us into week 3 with the killers in the white coats. Robert Proctor once wrote in his book on racial hygiene that upwards of 45% of German doctors had ranks in the SS. And so you see this collusion developing here, the overlapping of a state within a state, the SS, and then something like the medical community. What kind of diabolical collusion are you going to see here as a result? And I'm going to go into that in week 3. And so you see the stage set here for 1939, when Germany begins to take control of Western Europe and assert its master race notion of not only dominating Western Europe, but setting up in particular the East. Let's understand something. The reason you're going to have this war is what Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, that the future of the Reich is not in the West, it's in the East. This is where the resources are. more coal, iron ore, zinc, tungsten, manganese, obviously here, oil, and Ukraine, the breadbasket. This is going to, these people are going to be seen as slave laborers. This is going to be one of the reasons you're going to have the Nuremberg Trials. And they will be overseen in Eastern Europe by Nazi overseers. And so the stage will be set for when we come back as to these trials. And I'm going to start off when we come back with the first trials, November 20, 1945, with some of the cream of Nazi gangsterdom, Nazi political gangsterdom, such as Hermann Goering, Julius Streicher, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Hans Frank, people like this. What I would like to do now is, since we've maybe set the stage here, be able to take questions from people in the audience, and questions, points, observations, however you want to contribute, you may do so. Well, when you go back to Nazi Germany, and you read Goebbels, you read Hitler, and it's in Mein Kampf, Lee. I mean, you can find this in Mein Kampf, about channeling people's opinion, and Hitler appealing to the lowest intelligent quotient in a group. That way everybody gets the message. So when you take a look at Hitler with his speeches are really something to really research. And I remember a young German saying, well, he said he was uttering all that nonsense. He was always not uttering. However, it's the approach. He would start off, he was usually, number one, he was usually late. That raises the excitement. Two, he started off slow. And then all of a sudden he'd find the words, and his voice would raise. His shirt would become a little wet. He's now moving his hands. And by the end, I mean, people are into this. His hair might be a little mussed, and he's standing straight up and he's using his hands like this. And people are getting into it. It's almost like they forget what he's saying. They are into theatrics. And so when you go back and look at technology, the microphone and the radio helped make Hitler. Isn't that what helped make Franklin D. Roosevelt? I remember as a kid watching Kennedy on television, just like my mother and father listened to Franklin D. Roosevelt on the radio, but you were together in a group. Now you got what? Tweets? Facebook? And so here you see these communications making certain politicians, because they know how to get their message across. They know how to galvanize. They know how to galvanize the masses. And Lee, you heard me say this before. The mass cannot think. Individuals do. Hence, people like Sam Adams, Maximilian Robespierre, Vladimir Lenin, Benito Mussolini, Adolf Hitler. How about Jim Jones or Donald Trump, for that matter? And people gravitate, especially when they feel down on their luck. Maybe we ought to take a chance on this guy. Maybe this guy will deliver. They most always don't. The people get sucked into it, and before you know it, they are complicit in the crimes to follow. History shows this over and over and over ad nauseum, which leads you to think, when you're brought up, didn't your parents try to teach you to be an independent thinker, do things on your own, right? Well, what happens to that when you get into society? You think some avenues of society like you being an independent thinker? Not on your life. Okay, let's go there. I mean, is that what, does that happen in certain societies? It. Well, like Voltaire once said, you want to keep the military in line? Occasionally take a general out and shoot him. Stalin got miles out of that one. And so you see here, again, the Nuremberg trials are an attempt, and I'm going to get into this deeper as we go along. The Nuremberg trials were an attempt to try to correct this situation for the future generations. That's what this was an attempt to do, an attempt at international jurisprudence. That's what you're trying, that's what you're going to be seeing, and that's what we're going to get into here as we go along. Well, when you don't have a functioning system of representative government, or you have a society that does not function, a culture that's degenerate, I mean, where do you think it's going to go? It doesn't take much to figure it out. Especially when people feel ostracized from their government. They feel ostracized from their culture. They feel ostracized from the economy. They feel ostracized from society. They're going to gravitate to people who feel the same way. And that's where some of this goes. Fascinating when you do a psychological character sketch of not only people, but societies. Emil Durkheim wrote a book called Suicide. And he gets into this. It's an interesting book to read. He gets into this. It's not just individuals, but entire nations commit suicide. Because maybe the people have given up on their institutions. They've given up on their traditions. They've given up on their social mores, that kind of thing. Well, we're going to write this, but what are they going to do? Destroy it before you write it? Fascinating. And like you said, it repeats. It does. So,
thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Stay warm and stay safe and healthy. Thank you, Mark.
Amanda, thank you very much. Appreciate it.